This is WJTS Inform, and today we're going to be talking with State Senator Mark Messmer, representing District 48, about what's happening in the legislation this week. And there's some bills that have been moved off the floor, and there's some bills that have moved out of committee that you're pretty excited about. A lot of things happened, though, Senator. There were more than just the bills we're going to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. There was a lot of bills moved out of committee this week. We did have 38 bills that received final passage this week. I think there was about 20 to 25 the 2 weeks before. Next week it'll be, probably closer to 50 to 60, that'll, over the next 2 weeks, that, we'll probably move, quite a bit more, because there was a lot of things popped out of committee this week. Some of the bigger bills that we'll be dealing with in the, for this session. A lot of them just take time to get refined, and sometimes the committee hearings maybe, spill over multiple weeks. So, big week of a lot of activity. Like I said, out of the 38 bills that passed final passage, 3 of them were bills that I authored, so I was pretty pleased with that.
Now, what we want to point out, the final passage in the
Senate. Then
they will go to the House.
Yes.
They're not law yet. They still got to go through that. Okay.
Correct. So, of those 3, I don't expect any trouble on the House side. I mean, you kind of know sometime a bill might be up for some rough water when it gets across the building, but yeah, these 3 should be pretty smooth. One of them, there's been since last June, and we may have talked about this in an earlier program, the company Southeast Trans, they are supposed to be responsible for scheduling all non-emergency medical transports for anybody that's under Medicaid coverage. And it's been pretty much of a disaster of a rollout. They have very few, if any, providers in southern Indiana, anywhere. And it's impacted constituents for me, from every corner of my district. A day doesn't go by that I don't get a call or an email from somebody who's scheduled a pickup with Southeast Trans and then nobody shows up at all, or they cancel 10 minutes before they're supposed to be at their appointment. People miss their doctor's appointments. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So Senate Bill 480 is going to require Southeast Trans on their website to list in every county who the providers are, who the companies are provided with, and how many drivers they have available. And we're going to find out how many. They say, oh, it's just you. Oh, it's just you. They tell all of us that complain, oh, you're just an isolated incident. Well, we're going to find out how isolated we are, because I think it's a lot less isolated than they want to admit. And then to post each month how many missed rides, how many rides did they complete, and how many did they miss.
That kind of goes back to sometimes what happens in an urban area is a whole lot different than what happens in the rural area.
Exactly.
And that's why it's good to have someone in a rural area working for us.
Yeah. So that passed unanimously. It'll fly through on the House side. I would have preferred we put some penalties in it for noncompliance, but wasn't able to get quite that much oomph behind the bill, but it doesn't mean it can't happen on the House side. Okay. Then Senate Bill 230 was my bill that resets. We had on construction projects, there was a appeals court ruling a couple years ago that said basically the general contractor on the project is responsible for any damage or anything that happens even by negligence of a subcontractor, which was kind of contrary to what we thought our law said. So Senate Bill 230 resets that each contractor and subcontractors is responsibility for if they're at fault at somebody getting hurt or damaged, each person is responsible for their own behavior and conduct, and sailed through unanimously, had bipartisan authorship, and should get smooth treatment on the House side. And then Senate Bill 231, the people people like Amway, Mary Kay, direct sales companies, our labor definitions didn't quite create a clear enough boundary for potential for somebody to file for unemployment or workman's compensation. We wanted to clearly delineate in our statutes, like 38 other states have, the federal definitions of what a direct salesperson is, and how they meet the definition of direct sales, so they're not an employee of the person that they're buying their product or services from and then reselling. Okay. So unanimous support on that one as well, and bipartisan authorship. So those were ones that flew through. And then we had a couple other ones that were interesting. Senate Bill 94 would end the practice of any forced annexations by municipalities. It would require in any potential annexation that 51% of the property owners or 75% of the property value, if there's whichever one or the other could come into play, have to, if 51% of the voters authorize it, it's done, and I think and then 75% of the overall, could be somebody. It could be one person with a lot of land, but not much representation. So it would keep all of those requirements in place, and and the practice of cities just going out and grabbing property for extra tax value. Jasper has never had an annexation, nor has Huntingburg, that didn't have, I think Jasper's standard, as I said, we want at least 60% of the property owners, or we're not even going to hear your request. Mm-hmm. So there's not been problems here, but there's communities where it has been. And that passed 36-13 and is now off to the House for consideration. And then Senate Bill 109 gives every community the ability to adopt a 1% food and beverage tax, by if their municipality, their city council, approves it for adoption locally. Our practice the last decades have been each county, each city, anybody who wants it has to come in and apply for it, and we approve them pretty much any time a community wants the ability to adopt it. We've pretty much any time they've asked for it, we've given them the authority to then go, get it passed in their communities. Sometimes communities follow up with it, sometimes they don't. But rather than us have to approve every food and beverage tax application, just gives locals, either at the county level or the city level, if they want to adopt it, it's their either county council or county commissioners or whatever, or city councils, mm-hmm. They would have to approve it, enacting it, but rather than have us have to approve each one, which we've always approved any of them that have asked. So Senate Bill 109 would allow that to happen, in any community that would choose to enact it at a 1% level.
And that probably is more of a local thing anyway.
It would be. It's always local decision. Mm-hmm. Even when we enable them, they still have to adopt it locally.
Okay.
So that one it's just a streamlining of a process. There's no reason why every year we should have to authorize 5 or 10 or 15 requests year after year after year. So those were some of the bills of broad interest. There was a lot of them are just cleanup bills like normal. And then a couple of bills that I had pop out of committee this week, which I was pretty excited about.
And this would be that they come out of committee, then they'll go to the House for voting, and then they will go. Not to the House. They'll go to the Senate for voting, and then they'll go to the House.
Yeah, but getting them out of committee
is a big deal.
It's kind of a big deal.
Okay.
Because probably only about 15 to 20% of the bills that are filed get out of committee.
Okay.
So getting a hearing in a committee is important, and then getting a vote out of committee. You're dead in the water without that. Mm-hmm. So, and both my bills that passed out of committee this week passed unanimously. So very, very excited about that. Bipartisan support, unanimous support. So my Senate Bill 551, we're calling that the Victims' Bill of Rights bill. It's got 10 different sections that we're updating in code. The biggest, the first section of that is if a person is convicted of failing to register as a sex offender. Currently, there's really no fallout for not complying, other than you have to go back and register. So what? And people who are required to register on that, it's always a 10-year window. When they're complete their sentence in prison, or after conviction or plea, whatever the 10 years after their sentence is up, then they've got to register as a sex offender. And what this bill would do is if they're convicted of failing to register, a judge doesn't mean they have to, reset their 10-year clock. So some people might go years without registering, and then get to the end of their sentence, or close to the end of their sentence, and get convicted of it, and there's no repercussion. So That's piece one. Piece two comes from a case in Fort Wayne where in a juvenile court, a judge released an unredacted, file on a infant murder case. He released the autopsy photos, details of the murder. After the investigation was done, they're only supposed to release the redacted copy, which identifying information of the child, their name, details of how they were killed, were supposed to be, the details are supposed to be redacted so you don't end up, making it difficult to get a fair trial. Mm-hmm. So then, but the second provision would be redacting that information, before it can be released, anything that would be, critical to the investigation or the trial. Third piece comes from a constituent here at home, allowing a parent, if they have a child who's being groomed by a sex predator, to allow them to get a protective order in court, if they can clearly, show the judge, that their child has been the technical terms were conditioned for sexual activity. So if a minor is being groomed by a predator and a parent has proof to show that, they can get a protective order keeping that other adult away from their child. Several provisions in code needed to be cleaned up to deal with mistaken age as a defense. So if a person is under 14, it's sexual molestation. If you have sexual activity with somebody under 14, if they're 14, it is, sex with a minor. So okay. Sex with a minor or sexual molestation, there's two different charges for that, but if in several places, someone could say, well, the person was 13, but I thought they were 14 or 15, and so I'm neither guilty of sexual molestation because I thought they were 14, and I'm not guilty of sex with a minor because they were only 13. So there's a loophole in several places where they could plead, not guilty to either charge because of mistaken age. So we're getting rid of that loophole in a couple places in code, and dealing with domestic battery, increasing the penalties, for strangulation, because the prosecutor said that there's a clear link of the potential for that person to commit murder if they in a battery case, if they commit strangulation. There's a high propensity for that person who strangles people at any point to eventually be a person who is a person who commits murder later on with that same victim or maybe with other victims. That strangulation is, and many times they've shown in court, where the people who do strangulation, they get the person to the point of death and then release them, kind of as a power trip. And it's a very high predictor of escalating violence later. So they wanted a penalty enhancement for that, and that covered several sections of code. And then in the case of either unlawful confinement or having a brain lapse here.
That's right.
Anyway, where you unlawfully confine someone, if you injure them to the point of a severe enough injury to have them permanently disabled, it's an enhancement to the penalty. If there's moderate bodily injury, it's level 5 for just criminal confinement. Level 3 if you severely hurt them as part of that, but nothing in between. So if you just break their arm, there's no enhancement. If you paralyze them, there's an enhancement. So we're adding a middle layer.
A fourth.
Yeah, level 4.
Okay.
Yeah. So strong support in committee for that, and that was all spawned out of the local case last year, looking for the parent who was looking for a way to deal with that grooming issue that wasn't covered in code, and then working with the prosecutors over the summer and fall with that, we just uncovered several other places that they wanted to do a comprehensive bill for victims of crime, and so that'll be on the floor this week for final passage, and expected to get good treatment.
Very good. And then the other bill has to do with gaming?
Gaming, yep. So
and this has come out of
out of Public Policy Committee Wednesday. So that one, there's been several changes over the years in our riverboat original business model. They were either on the Ohio or they were on Lake Michigan. Several years later, they decided they don't need to sail anymore. They're just going to let them dry dock. A few years later, we added the racinos in Shelbyville and Anderson, the French Lick Casino, land-based, the racinos land-based. Then a couple years ago, we let all the casinos, move on to land. But there's two boats in Gary that they want to relocate for an industrial development.
Okay.
And moving one within the city of Gary, and the other one, if it gets approved by the voter referendum, allow them to move to Terre Haute. And then also the biggest other component of that is legalizing sports betting within our casinos in Indiana. Currently, you can either bet illegally at your local bookie, or you can bet online, with casinos in New Jersey or Las Vegas.
Okay.
And there was a Supreme Court ruling that lets each state regulate that, within their state boundaries. And a lot of technology that goes into place with that, and oversight by the Gaming Commission to make sure there's, good consumer protections as part of it. So, because currently they would either do, betting in Las Vegas or New Jersey or offshore, right, or the local, with your local bookie. But a lot of details to put that together, and some other overarching, changes to the rules that all the casinos, get impacted by. But that one passed out 10-0 on Wednesday, so very, very pleased with that one, and that'll move to the Appropriations Committee because it's potentially a pretty good revenue generator for the state by relocating, those two casinos, and it's probably a once in a generation, reset on the actual physical locations of where the casinos are allowed to operate.
Okay, and so that'll be on the floor then
Should-
probably
yep,
next week.
yep.
Okay. Well, Senator, thank you very much for coming in once again.
You're very welcome.
Busy week. We'll have you back again next Friday. We'll talk more about what happens in the State Senate.
Very good. Thank you.
Our guest has been State Senator Mark Messmer, representing District 48. Thank you for watching WJTS Inform. We're local people watching local people.